Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I talk a lot about how NOAA and NASA rewrite U.S. temperature history, and in this video I'm going to show you exactly how they do it. I'm going to be showing a lot of graphs in this presentation, but before I start with the graphs, I want to talk a little bit about the year 1921. It's important to keep some real-world perspective to correlate with the graphs. 1921 was one of many extreme weather years in the U.S. and in fact around the world. The New York Times said, "Earth has a fever," the same words used by Al Gore 85 years later. New York Times, October 3, 1921, "Freak weather laid to earthly mumps." The old spheroid known as the Earth is emerging from what some human diagnosticians might call a severe attack of meteorological mumps. It has been accompanied by an intermittent fever manifested in a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. Meanwhile, the United States for the last year has been suffering chiefly from an excess to high temperature and deficiency of moisture, a condition unprecedented in the 50-year history of the Weather Bureau. And it wasn't just heat and drought, it was also floods. Repeatedly during the past summer, the front pages of the papers have been filled with the news of flood disasters. Hundreds of lives have been lost and millions of dollars worth of property destroyed. Two good-sized American cities have seen floods tear the hearts out of their business sections. Many smaller places have been damaged, and countless farms have been flood-swept. One of those cities was Pueblo, Colorado, where a series of flash floods during June killed about 1,500 people. During the following winter, it was reported that the waters around Spitsbergen had warmed up about 12 degrees Celsius and that the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast. It was reported as a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. By contrast, this year there's lots of ice around Spitsbergen, shown inside the red circle, the most ice that's been there in many years. There was something very extreme going on with the climate in 1921, and heat covered a great portion of the Earth. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels are very low, and this pretty much destroys the idea that carbon dioxide is the cause of extreme weather. 1921 was the hottest year on record in Texas. Encino, Texas had an incredible 157 consecutive days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit from May 8, 1921 until October 11th of that year. And Falfurrias, Texas was above 70 degrees Fahrenheit every single day except one during January of 1921. The average afternoon temperature at Falfurrias during January 1921 was 79 degrees. The really amazing thing about 1921 was how the heat lasted the entire year. 1921 was just one of many extreme years in U.S. history. Now we're going to look at how the data has been altered by government agencies. This was NASA's 1999 version of U.S. temperatures. They showed 1934 as the warmest year, 1921 as second warmest, and 1998 about 0.6 degrees Celsius cooler than 1934. And they showed a significant cooling trend from the 1930s through the end of the 20th century. But NASA has changed everything with their more recent graphs. They made 1998 warmer than 1934 and turned the long-term cooling trend into a warming trend. I'm going to flash back and forth a few times between the two versions just to make it clear what's happening. 1999 cooling, 2019 warming, 1999 cooling, 2019 warming. It's difficult for some people to believe that government scientists would do this, but these two graphs are right off the NASA web pages. NASA actually gets their temperature data from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so now we're going to look directly at the NOAA data. This graph shows the raw U.S. temperature data from NOAA before it gets tampered with. The graph shows the average daily maximum temperature across the United States for the past century. You can see that there's been a fairly strong cooling trend. 1934 was the hottest year, and 1921 was the second hottest. And this graph shows the percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius. You can see that 1936 was the hottest summer and that there's been a strong decrease in the amount of hot days in the United States. The main reason that the U.S. is getting cooler is because we have a lot fewer hot summer days than we used to. And this graph shows the average minimum or nighttime temperature. You You can see that since the early 1980s, there's been a fairly strong warming trend in nighttime temperatures around the United States. One reason for this warming trend in nighttime temperatures is because we have a lot fewer really cold nights in the United States than we used to. This graph shows the percent of nights below 0 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 18 degrees Celsius. You might see something very interesting in this graph. 1936 had the most cold nights on record in the United States. And 1936 also had the most hot afternoons on record in the United States. 1936 was a very extreme year. It not only had the most hot days and most cold nights, but there was also incredible flooding. My grandfather had to be evacuated by boat from a business meeting in downtown Pittsburgh on March 21, 1936. And besides flooding, there was drought. In Australia, it was reported that the 1936 drought was the worst in U.S. history. Thousands of people died in the incredible heat. Canberra Times reported that the cold in 1936 broke all records in America, worst in memory. 1936 also brought some of the worst tornado disasters to the United States, and all of this occurred at very low levels of carbon dioxide. The 1920s and 1930s had extreme weather all around the planet. The 1939 fires in Victoria burned up a 250-mile strip from Melbourne to Canberra. The 1939 fires in Victoria were larger than those which occurred this year. But let's go back to the United States. This graph shows the average daily temperature range over the past century. It's the difference between daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures. You can see how they've been declining, and last year was the lowest on record. The United States has fewer hot days and fewer cold nights than we used to. In other words, the U.S. climate is getting less extreme. This is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists want you to believe. But now it's time to get down to the point of this video, the alteration of the U.S. temperature record. This graph shows the average mean temperature across the United States over the past century. The mean temperature is the average of the daily maximum and the daily minimum temperatures. The warmest average temperature in the United States occurred in 2012, followed by 1921, 1930, and 1934. This is what the raw temperature data shows, a slight cooling trend over the past century. But NOAA doesn't release graphs of the raw temperature data. Instead, they alter it before they release it to the public. This is what the public is shown, a strong warming trend over the past century. This graph bears no resemblance to the underlying thermometer data. When the public sees these graphs from NOAA, they have no idea that the data has been tampered with. People just assume that it's the actual thermometer data. This graph shows how the data is being altered. Older temperatures in the United States are cooled about 1 degree below the actual thermometer readings, and more recent temperatures are warmed as much as 1 degree above the actual thermometer readings. There's a spectacular hockey stick of data tampering going on. This graph shows the same thing, except instead of time across the x-axis, now we have atmospheric carbon dioxide. You can see how temperatures are being tampered with exactly in line with the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is the ultimate in junk science. They're altering the data to match their theory. The exact opposite of how science is supposed to function. Now we're going to look at the details of how the data is being altered. Every month, NOAA marks a certain percentage of the data as being estimated, meaning that it came from a computer model rather than from a thermometer. This graph shows the percent of estimated data over the past century. For most of the last century, it was around 10% estimated, but in recent years it's skyrocketed up to nearly 50% estimated. When they use a computer model to make up half of the data, they can get any result they want. This graph shows the NOAA adjusted temperature for only the stations which had actual thermometer data. It shows about 1 degree warming over the past century. The claimed warming is based on an adjustment called the time of observation bias. This adjustment is wildly exaggerated, but that's not the topic of this video, and I'm not going to go into that right now. This next graph is the really interesting one. This is the graph of temperatures created from their computer model. It shows about 4 degrees warming from completely fake temperatures. And remember, these fake temperatures make up nearly 50% of the current NOAA US temperature data. And that's how NOAA turns a long-term cooling trend measured by thermometers into a fake long-term warming trend generated by computer models. And when they release their graphs to the public, they don't put any warnings or disclaimers on the graphs. The public, press, and policymakers believe that they're seeing actual thermometer data, but they're not. Imagine what would happen to a private corporation who turned a downward trend in their financial data into an upward trend by altering the data. And then they used the excuse that they had a computer model which differed from reality. The business people would be prosecuted, but government climate scientists are rewarded for doing exactly the same thing. Now let's look at the history of how this occurred. In 1986, NASA's James Hansen appeared before Congress and told them that the overheating of Earth poses a survival threat. Hansen said the average U.S. temperature has risen from 1 to 2 degrees since 1958 and is predicted to increase an additional 3 or 4 degrees sometime between the year 2010 and 2020. According to James Hansen, the U.S. should have warmed 4 to 6 degrees since the year 1958. But the actual thermometer data shows that the U.S. has cooled since 1958. James Hansen was completely wrong. However, James Hansen was also the guy in charge of the data at NASA, so he simply altered the data to match his predictions. He wrote this paper in 1999 lamenting the fact that U.S. temperatures were not doing what he expected. In 1999, Hansen wrote, "Empirical evidence does not lend much support to the notion that climate is headed precipitately toward more extreme heat and drought. The drought of 1999 covered a smaller area than the 1988 drought when the Mississippi almost dried up. In 1988 was a temporary inconvenience as compared with repeated droughts during the 1930s Dust Bowl that caused an exodus from the prairies as chronicled in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath." Shortly after that 1999 paper, Hansen began the new practice of altering data to match his predictions. Reality wasn't cooperating with his theory, so he simply changed the data. Initially, he met resistance to this in the climate community. Tom Karl and Phil Jones wrote in 1989 that the entire U.S. warming trend was due to an urban heat island effect. And in 1989, the New York Times and NOAA reported that the U.S. data since 1895 failed to show a warming trend. After examining climate data extending back nearly 100 years, a team of government scientists has concluded that there's been no significant change in average temperatures or rainfall in the United States over that entire period. The study made by scientists for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was published in the current issue of Geophysical Research Letters. This study was a direct rebuke to NASA's James Hansen, who 3 years earlier told Congress that the United States had warmed 1 to 2 degrees since 1958 and was going to warm an additional 3 or 4 degrees by the year 2020. Also in 1989, NOAA's Tom Karl said, "Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Karl said. This is the exact opposite of the hockey stick which NOAA and NASA now peddle. It appears that in 1989, Tom Karl at NOAA was a skeptic and was at odds with NASA's James Hansen. But sometime after 1989, NOAA switched over to the dark side and started altering data along with NASA's James Hansen. Tom Karl retired from NOAA right after President Trump was elected. I've always wondered if he was concerned about facing investigations from the Trump administration. Anyway, if James Hansen is correct, look for 4 to 6 degrees warming in the United States this year. And remember to visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.